Okay, why don't we start with I'll start with some introductions and then we can get our conversation underway. So, good morning, everybody. Um, I'm Kelly Lyman. I'm the coordinator of the Executive Leadership Program at the Neag School. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is our second speaker event in our Building Bridges, Informing Practices series. And we're very excited this morning to be able to share some of the good work that goes on at the University of Connecticut with those of you who are practitioners out in the field. And this morning, we're excited to have with us Dr. Preston Green. Dr. Green holds a BA in government from the University of Virginia, a JD from Columbia University, and an EDD in educational administration from Teachers College. He currently serves as the John and Maria Neag Professor of Urban Education and is a professor of education leadership and law at UConn. Dr. Green is a nationally recognized expert in legal issues surrounding charter schools, school vouchers, student rights, school desegregation, and school finance. And he's the author of 5 books and numerous articles, as well as being a highly sought after speaker. We're very happy to have Dr. Green with us today, and we'd like this conversation to be as interactive as possible. So we're going to do this in an interview format. I'll pose some questions to Dr. Green and invite you to offer comments or questions as we go. Simply just raise your hand, and we'll be sure to leave some time at the end for questions around things that we haven't discussed. So with that, good morning, Dr. Green.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. Just looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, I'm going to start off with a question that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds because it's been a very active period of time when you consider what's happened with the Supreme Court. So, in recent months, there have been several important as well as concerning rulings from the Supreme Court, and many of them potentially will continue to have significant impact upon the public education system. Considering recent rulings regarding K-12 education, which one or two do you see as most concerning?
So, thank you so much for having me. And there's a lot to choose from. Let's just put it this way: there's a lot to choose from over the past few years. But I'll talk about two cases. One, I think, with really pertinent to Connecticut, and another that's really of national significance that is ongoing. But the case that for Connecticut is Mahmoud versus Taylor. And I don't know if you've heard about the recent religious opt-out ruling, but this is what Mahmoud dealt with. It was a case where you had in Maryland, where you had parents from like different religious groups that claimed that the school district violated the free exercise clause by not allowing them to opt their elementary school children out of storybooks featuring LGBTQ plus themes. Now, the school district had originally permitted the opt-outs, but they stopped because it was just becoming very unmanageable. And also, the school refused to provide notice to the parents. And so this case went to the Supreme Court, and I can tell you that under prior law, it would be very clear that the court would have found in favor of the school district, but these are not those times. So in this case, the court ruled that school district's refusal to allow their kids to opt out violated the free exercise clause. And one reason for this conclusion was that the district's practice posed a very real threat, and I'm quoting here, of undermining the religious beliefs and practices that the parents wish to instill. And the court identified several factors in this case. For one, that we're talking about elementary age students. And also, when you read the case, you will see that that the lessons were portrayed in a very normative fashion, kind of like suggesting to the children what is the right way to think about these issues. So, because of this, the court found in this case that the school district violated the free exercise clause and that it must notify parents of the books in question or any other similar book, uh, and then also to allow opt-outs when there is indeed this undermining of sincerely held religious beliefs. But what's really kind of concerning here is while the court did not actually provide like a clear rule, right? It did not provide a clear rule for determining when and where parents' rights were, their sincere beliefs were being undermined. So that's going to be, it's going to make law very, law attorneys are going to make a lot of money trying to figure this out, and there's going to be a lot of litigation over this. So, so I think that so for Connecticut, this matters for Connecticut because as I understand it, Connecticut does have an opt-out rule, correct? And as I read, it's for AIDS and HIV, family life education, firearm safety, sexual abuse, assault weapons, and dissection. Did I get that? I
Yes.
think you're going to have to also tell, in addition to this, you're going to have develop religious opt-out policies. And you're going to have to do that. And Tom Mooney, um, who's a very well-respected attorney in Connecticut, had made the point that, you're going to have to start thinking about questions like evolution. You're going to have to start thinking about questions about race and justice. You're going to have to start thinking about people are going to bring up these questions, asserting that they have religious, that it's impacting their religious freedom. And so school districts are going to be having to develop policies and approaches for dealing with these issues. There's another reason for watching this case in that while it's a curriculum case, there may be implications for vaccination policies. Connecticut is one of several states that do not have religious opt-outs for vaccinations, right? And the Second Circuit, United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, found that this not this lack of a religious opt-out provision did not violate the free exercise clause. But the Second Circuit just recently the Supreme Court just found in December last month that New York State, which also has a policy like Connecticut's, and where the Second Circuit also has jurisdiction over, it asked the Second Circuit to rethink its decision or reconsider its decision in light of the Mahmoud case. So we're watching this right now. I mean, it would seem to me that Mahmoud is very different from vaccinations. And one is curriculum and one is, health and safety. But it's not clear where the court may come out on this, but it is really something that really, really should be paying attention to. And I think the second case I'll just very briefly talk about of national implications.
Preston, before you
Yes,
go to the second case, can I just ask a clarifying question about that?
sure.
You said that districts are going to have to create policies to allow religious opt-out. Should current practice be challenged, or is that a step that will need to be taken preemptively?
They're going to have to do it. Right. I think that they're going to have to start thinking about this. Right. And you're already seeing a number of states talking about various approaches that they can take. The case does mention some states with good policies or possible policies like Minnesota. I know California is thinking about this. I know that attorneys in Connecticut are saying that school districts are going to have to start doing this as well.
That's kind of frightening as a former superintendent to
Well,
think about the limits that some of these opt-out options might extend to.
and I think that there's a danger here. I think that as a policy matter and a pedagogical matter, there's a real concern that school districts might, in response to this, just edit themselves, right? Censor themselves because they just don't want to deal with um, with the conflict that may occur, the controversy that may occur. So, I mean, there is a real worry that there might be a lot of self-censoring that may occur. I think a lot of us are hoping that, I mean, the Supreme Court in its decision made clear that, that you may not have to do this, but you may have to have policies where, or thinking out how you deal with these requests, how you determine when someone's religious freedom is being impacted in a very fact-intensive way, and then think about like accommodations, right? Like, what other ways would you assess those students if they're not going to be exposed to this particular material? So it's going to be a lot of work to think this thing through, and there's some concerns about that. The dissent raised concerns about saying, well, you identified certain concerns and certain things to think about, but in practice, there may be no real guardrails or no real guidance to figure this out. So um, it's going to take some while to figure out how to do this.
It sure will. Yeah. And your point about schools self-censoring themselves is also of concern because that also raises the questions about teacher autonomy or authority to
Right.
select something as simple as a read aloud text.
Great. That's a
Yeah,
great question. And can I just interject as well
yeah.
in this thinking about this? I mean, and it also brings up in questions in states like where you have a union, for instance, like you have to also think about like, what will teachers be expected to do in these situations, right? So that's also going to have to be teased out and figured out with respect to the work that teachers are expected to do to comply with this decision.
I just want to also restate, because I know some people joined after the introduction, that we'd like this to be as interactive as we can make it. So if you have questions or comments at any time when Dr. Green is speaking, please feel free to use the raise the hand signal down on the bottom sort of center of your screen, and we'd be happy to have your voice join this conversation.
Yes. Very briefly, I would just mention if or should we go on to the next question before I just want to make sure. But I think very briefly, I'll just say the one case that really has national implications and it's ongoing is it was just recently decided was Oklahoma State Appeal Board versus Drummond. This was a case dealing with the constitutionality of a proposed religious charter school in Oklahoma. And this was a school that would have been an online school that would have been run by two local dioceses. And, people are really shocked to think about the possibility of religious charter schools because charter schools are supposed to be public, but it's a really thorny question for constitutional purposes because they have these, they also have these private characteristics, among other things. 34 states require schools to be run by private entities. And this running by private entities makes it a question as to whether or not they are what we would call public or state actors under the Constitution, meaning they have to follow the Constitution. And so the question in Oklahoma was that this Oklahoma case was that, you know, if they were not state actors, then it may follow that Oklahoma would have to allow these schools to be religious, that they could not prevent them from being religious. And the Supreme Court ruled 4-4 on that question, and that left in place this Oklahoma State Supreme Court decision saying that these charter schools cannot be religious. So, while there's a reprieve right now, that means this case is going to come up again. And Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who recused herself, will be ruling on a future case. And this matters for states like Connecticut and other states because this is a national question, right? Um, and almost every state has a charter school law and has charter schools, including the state. And so there's going to be pressure um, if and when the Supreme Court rules that this is constitutional and that they have to be allowed, you're going to see pushes in northern states to figure out how to deal with this issue. And I'm working with other folks to figure out ways. There are ways that states can ensure that their schools are indeed, um, you know, public schools for constitutional purposes, not just for religion, but for other purposes as well. And so that's just something that I want to put on your radar to be paying attention to, because in a couple of years that's going to happen, and there's going to be pressure nationwide to adopt these schools.
So as you share these cases, it has me thinking about this like church and state separation and the ways in which religious organizations or beliefs are trying to work their way beyond or around that separation. Are there other challenges that we should be mindful of or coming down the pike, things that we should be looking for?
Well, on the Supreme Court, you might have seen there was just yesterday, I think a couple of days ago, there were oral arguments on the transgender case. It was dealing with, I think, Iowa and West Virginia, and the question was whether or not transgender women, girls and women can participate in athletics. And we're watching this case because, you know, the question deals with, the proposed deals with Title IX, which is a federal statute prohibiting sex discrimination. And there's a question about whether or not, you know, students are protected under the Equal Protection Clause, which is a constitutional provision that provides protections against, discriminatory treatment, but understand that there are different levels of protection. And the question would be, what is the standard for transgender students? And so there's a lot here, right? That if they decide on this, this could deal with bathrooms, it could deal with all other issues besides athletics. But it seems as though, listening to the oral arguments, that maybe they'll just limit this to Title IX and not really go beyond that. But we don't know. And I think there's another question as well, is like, it doesn't get to the question of whether states must prevent participation. We're not there yet, but do understand that, there may be an attempt in the future for that to happen as well. So that's really something that people should be paying attention to, in addition to the cases that I just named.
So if it doesn't prevent participation, what could the implications be, especially in a state like Connecticut, where we have very well-defined rights for transgender people?
I don't think it affects them right now. I don't think that it would impact them right now. You know, but on, but you know, I think you have executive orders that are trying to get at these sorts of things. So um, this sort of pressure from the Trump administration, from federal government, may force the hand of states like Connecticut in the future. So I think, as of now, we're okay, but you know, as I like to say in these situations, it's a developing situation and something that we really should be paying attention to.
Okay, so pivoting just a little bit, thinking about this idea of religious schools and opportunities for schools other than public schools. I know you've recently completed a significant study on the impact to rural communities when schools close, and in particular, the impact felt by communities by charter schools and vouchers and other choice opportunities. We also know that this administration is putting pressure on governors in the form of tax credits to allow for more school privatization and choice. Can you talk a little bit about your findings in the research and
Sure.
again, the challenges ahead?
I would be very happy to talk about that. And I should tell you that, like, people ask me about this all the time, and why would I be interested in this? Because I have a chair in urban education, and so and I was just on a podcast the other day when why are you interested in this? And I think part of it is that even though from a personal perspective, I've lived and worked in rural settings now for more than 2 decades. It's, central Pennsylvania. I lived in rural eastern Connecticut, northeast Connecticut, in the Quiet Corner, and recently I'm now commuting now from upstate New York. And in those settings, I mean, there's a real concern about the expansion of charter schools and voucher schools. In fact, about 1 in 5 students in this country, about almost 10 million students, live in communities that are designated as rural. And these communities tend to be very small and sparse. And so the concern, right as of now, charters and vouchers have not expanded into these communities. They're really more of a urban phenomenon, but they're very concerned about what might happen if you start having expansion in these communities, because what could happen is that if you have even just a few kids or who leave public schools to attend a voucher program or to attend a charter school, that could actually result in these schools closing. And if you've been in a rural area, you know that many of these places, there's a lot of travel. There's a lot of travel. You're talking maybe anywhere from 3 to 4 hours, possibly, from going to, if one school closes, to go to the next possibly available public school. There are also obviously educational concerns. There's research showing that if schools close, there are issues about, there's issues for educational attainment, and there's also concerns about discipline issues. But even more importantly, in the case of rural communities, these schools are the hub. They hold communities together. And there's this concern that Mara Casey Teakin, who's a rural researcher, has found that there's this real concern that if you have school closures, that you could have like schools actually being converted into converted into ghost towns, because you don't have that school serving as the hub holding schools together. So it's not, so you had, in the recent elections in 2024, there are 3 states that actually fought voucher and charter expansion, and rural communities were, a real part of the reason why that didn't happen. So with that backdrop, my colleagues and I wanted to think about what are ways in situations where rural community, where you have charters and vouchers, is there a way that you can protect these communities? Um, and so, we're thinking about this, we were like going like, well, in natural resources law, and there are other areas of law where we try to protect public goods, like natural resources, you know, forests, plants, soil, so on, wildlife. And we took that idea for protecting natural resources and applied them to rural communities. And what we're calling them are education preserves. And so what we're saying is that states should identify rural communities that are small and sparse, that they know may face danger from charter and voucher expansion, and designate them as these preserves where you would not allow future charter school and voucher growth. And that, this borrows from, among other things, like state hunting laws, which use the same approach to protect wildlife in areas where where there's this real danger. And this idea about education preserves is also consistent with other state laws across the country that protect rural communities. In fact, about 36 states, for instance, have additional funding for rural school districts, to provide for transportation and educational needs, because it's much more expensive to educate, to run schools in these communities because they're so small. So, so that's the idea that we put together, and we presented this, in Wisconsin, Wisconsin Public Education Network, and also talked to the National Rural Education Association about this. And it's just sort of like a mechanism that we're using to try to begin to think about how we can preserve public education um, in this environment now where we're having voucher and charter school growth.
And that's very creative response. Um,
Yeah.
I'm hoping we can find something as creative for some of these other rulings that are coming down. Do you see more pressure coming to Connecticut for this tax credit piece for parents for private school?
I do. I think that right now it's like the way that this is part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, where it's like I think tax credits, and that you either the governor or some designated body has can start opting in starting in 2027. And so states are already feeling this pressure, right? They're already feeling this pressure. And I think that it will, I think that Connecticut and other states will be feeling this pressure. The danger here is that, you know, the saying goes, you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. You do this the first time, and then it's going to be hard to stop other, you know, it's going to be hard to turn down attempts to increase these policies. And I think that the moment you start doing this, there'll become pressure from, to also have the state policies also include vouchers and charter expansion as well. And that will create that pressure to think about how you're going to preserve public education in this new environment. So, I'm part of a group that's been working on this and thinking about this and really cautioning states to be very careful about doing this, understanding that this will not be the end of it. There will be increases down the road.
Mm. Mm. I'm just going to pause for a minute to see again if there are any comments or questions that people might have around this topic. So I'm going to stay sort of on this topic for a bit. This idea of privatization and even the idea of parental rights. A lot of what we hear coming out of Washington with every action around education is about restoring parental rights or giving parents more opportunity to choose what they want for their children. It seems to me that it often results in excluding others or preventing our children from having the benefit of diverse perspectives. And yet, when you despite what we're hearing coming out of Washington, when you think of public education, it means education for the public, right? To educate all. And recent actions on the part of the government and the Supreme Court seem to have intensified that tension between educating the public and educating for the public, versus allowing individual control, even letting parents cherry pick what books their kids are going to listen to and read aloud, right? So I wonder if you could comment on this, and more importantly, help us think about the response that's going to be needed by state and local districts.
Yeah, that is a very, very good question. And I think that like embedded in this question is this idea about like, in our educational system, in American education, we have this conflict. We have this dueling issue between the idea of education as a public good and education as a private good. And in terms of education being a public good, I mean, it's designed to prepare students for democracy. It's designed to, again, identify other public goods, preparing students for the workforce. Democracy, being good citizens, right? And this is embedded in state constitutions. State constitutions, every state has an education clause or an education provision, And many of them talk about it in terms of schools being thorough and efficient, or a system of thorough public schools or efficient public schools. This is all language about education as a public good. However, education is also a private good, and think about, like, with charters or vouchers, or even in a place, in Connecticut, where we're thinking about school choice, like intra-district and inter-district school choice. A lot of that is done as thinking about education as a private good. School choice is designed really to give students sort of like educational options that maybe they don't have in the traditional public setting. And so that's more of a private good idea for education. What has happened in the last 30 years, I would submit, with charters and vouchers, and even some of these discussions now with religion and the curriculum, is that what we have been doing is consistently over time prioritizing more and more the private good over the public good. And what we need to start doing, I think, conceptually, is thinking about how to get that balance right again. Get that balance right again, showing that, that we prioritize the public good. So that's sort of like conceptually how I think about this. And so what has to happen is that for that public good to happen, we have to understand what the role of the school district is. I mean, the school district is the body, for the most part, that decides kind of like what that public good is, how education is served within the communities. And we have to start saying that, and I've been trying to do this in my own work, saying that we have to start thinking about wherever these policies that we're putting forward, how do we make sure that public schools are prioritized and that they can still continue and fulfill their duty to meet the public good? Now, I see a hand. Sorry, Kelly. I know you.
Becky, go ahead.
So, so what I can understand, like what you're saying. My wonder, I have so many wonders about if it came to pass that, parents were able to get vouchers and move and use them towards public schools. I mean, towards private schools. Private independent schools are now getting essentially money for tuition that's coming from public coffers. My my worry about that, and a wonder I have, and I think would need to be addressed if that were to come to pass, is in currently, and I briefly worked for a private school, independent. They make their own rules. They are not
Yes.
bound by public requirements. For
Right.
example, teacher certificate, like teachers have in a public school must be certified for the subject that they're teaching. A private school does not have to abide by that stipulation. In addition, the private school I know that I worked for was allowed to, there was an admission process, and they could and did turn students away. And so that to me is, you're getting a pool of students that now, if this were to come to pass, this school would have public money, but could turn away and cherry pick who their students are. What is public about that? That's my wonder. And then who is left behind?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I have written about, and afterward I can send some article. I mean, like, there's a lot of research to back that up, that students who attend private schools and voucher programs do not have the same rights as traditional public school students, right? Um, you know, they
And
don't.
even so far as like boards of education in a public school, there's a process, even from an employee perspective and an HR perspective. There's a process. If someone in that public school or in leadership in that public school is acting in a way that is not aligned with ethical behavior, for example. There's a process for filing grievance and addressing that grievance, and accountability. And that was also something that I did not see in the example of a private school where I had once worked. So what would be a process for putting in place some accountability measures?
And I'll add to that, in the case of religious schools, that they are exempt. There's a concept called a ministerial exception. They are exempt from employment laws, right, that impact their ability to operate religiously. And Supreme Court case law has recognized this exception, this exception for them. So yeah, I mean, so teachers who work in these institutions do not have the protections that traditional public schools do have. And I think that has to be, people need to be made aware of this. And it's not even just for those, but even students with disabilities under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Private schools do not have to provide the same level of protection. They don't have to follow IDEA in the same way that traditional public schools have to follow them. And I have an article coming out with a recent graduate, Elizabeth Zagata, that has looked at voucher laws for students with disabilities. And we find that there are two ways that students are disadvantaged. Public school districts are, for one, public school districts are no longer have to cover them. And then two, so many of these statutes make it very clear that students do not have the same sort of, special education protections if they go into these private schools. So this, I think a lot of times parents are just not aware of what they lose, that they are signing their rights away when they go into these schools, and that it's hard for parents to get that until it happens to their kid, but it happens all the time. And I think that most kids are going to be in public schools. We do need to make sure that we have the resources for those kids, for the schools to meet the needs of those kids who are there.
Well, currently, in an independent school, a inability to meet a student's obligations under their IEP can be a reason for not allowing admission to that school. I know that was the case. And so if that's true, and I know in that case, that school does not have to have, OT, PT, people on hand, speech pathologists, special education teachers necessarily, depending, and maybe that would change if this changed. But so that if they're not employing those related services in terms of students with disabilities, obviously the cost of education at that particular school is much less. And also they're using that then as a rationale for why they cannot accept that student, because they cannot meet their needs.
Right.
But that's convenient for them as well, because meeting those needs would cost the school money.
Right. And so I think that, in some of the research that I've written about, we have made the argument that states need to import these protections for students with disabilities, English learners, sexual orientation, and so on, that they have to match that of public school students. I mean, my bumper sticker saying for this is that if the money follows the child, the rights should follow the child too. But that isn't what we have at the moment, and that is certainly something that we really need to be pushing for.
And, interestingly, the watchdog, if you will, over student rights often was the Department of Education and OCR. Want to say anything about that?
Yeah, there's a lot to say. I think that right now it's very clear it really is very clear that that the federal government right now is really de-emphasizing, um, you know, rights protections. It's really downsized OCR. It's moving things into health and human services, and you also have some of these, and I think that, yeah, I think I'll say that that is really, that is really what's going on right now, is that the federal government is very clearly moving away, I think, from rights enforcement. And I think that what that will mean is that, those states that don't wish to, a lot of states usually didn't do anything unless they felt the pressure of the federal government on them. But I think that states are going to have to pick up the slack, and that, that they're going to have to, in light of this, take a bigger role at state departments of education in making sure that the rights of students are protected. So that is certainly something that I think that you may have to see going forward, in that state departments of education become more strengthened to take up that role of protection of student rights.
I think we have time for one more topic, and it's related to that. One of the swiftest and probably loudest declarations of this administration was the attempt to eliminate all DEI initiatives. So we're thinking about rights of all, right? In fact, the executive orders suggest that a lot of the initiatives that probably many of us have put in place are unlawful. Can you talk a little bit about the legal authority of an executive order?
Right.
And actual laws regarding equity?
Right. Yeah, I think that, in thinking about this question, there's always the lawyerly argument. The lawyer, and this applies here, whenever we get this question, the answer always is, it depends. And understand that there is, that there is a sort of assumption of legality here with executive orders, but executive orders can be illegal. You know, they're illegal if they violate constitutional or statutory authority. And it just so happens that the there's a DEI proposal where there's like removal of consideration of race for everything. That's actually being challenged in the courts. It's being challenged in the courts as violative of the Constitution. There have also been, in the case of the Trump administration over the years, various of these executive orders have been challenged and have been found to be unconstitutional. Okay, so while that's happening, you're going like, well, that's nice, Dr. Green, that is happening, but what about us, right? What do we do as these things are going through the courts? And I think that the answer that I give with respect to this, and just hear me out on this, is that, you follow the law. And what does that mean? So when I say follow the law, I think that one thing that one thing that I think school districts can really, really prioritize and be sure about this is to be sure that they follow the Constitution. And we've just talked about, just a few minutes ago, all the rights that kids lose when they go from public schools to private schools, right? And let's talk about what those are. There's there's the First Amendment, there's free exercise, there's freedom of speech, there's freedom of association. Fourth Amendment, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. There's equal protection, right? And then there's, when we're thinking about the issue, one of the issues that come up is with discipline. Concerns about discipline and concerns about disparate impact and discipline and racial impact. That also implicates due process. Kids have due process rights for suspensions and for expulsions. And I think that, I've been teaching education law now for a long time, we'll say. And a lot of the cases that I have taught, a lot of these issues that I've taught where kids have had their rights violated have been Black and brown kids, especially with due process and especially with search and seizure. So you know, I think that one way that to really go very far in making sure that the rights of students are protected is to ensure that you're following the Constitution with respect to your dealings with them.
So the advice to all of us is follow the Constitution.
It's
Right.
there. And I'm going to say, forgive me for a second here. I mean, I know, are you all familiar with the Tinker case?
Mm-hmm.
You're all familiar with Tinker, right? And Tinker has that really famous phrase that students do not lose their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. Students, I had a chance to meet Mary Tinker a few years ago, and she gave, and she gave the history of that case. And she talked about how this case was, the impetus for them in pursuing this was the civil rights cases. It was the civil rights cases that were going on in the 60s. And it was that there were a lot of predominantly Black school districts where students were not having their free speech rights protected. It wasn't clear at the time that they had free speech rights. So this case was an impetus, was inspired by that. And it became that case that provided students with constitutional protections. And its basis is in that history. So I'm just saying that, that's why I'm kind of passionate about this and saying that this is really something that's really important. It's been fought for students and for teachers that I think that we can really honor.
Yeah, thank you. I want to open the floor again to see if you have questions for Dr. Green on any other topic or anything he's discussed this morning. There's certainly a lot going on. Okay, well, I have one more thing to ask you about, Preston. I've heard you say that what we've had, the system, the practices, and maybe even the expectations for education are ending. And the question now is what comes next? So I'm wondering what comes next, mostly in the sense of how do we exert pressure to ensure that what comes next continues to support education for the public good?
Right. That's a great question. I should say that in the lead up to where we are now, I'm a Game of Thrones fan. And so I used to have, I would wake people up because I would have a slide with the Night King. And the slide would say, "Winter is coming." And I would put that up and people would gasp, like, right? Well, winter is here.
Mm.
We're here now. And and what you're having really are major changes. I mean, federal government is sort of moving out of civil rights enforcement, and in many cases, making it clear what the things that it does want. And and there's going to be this pressure now with increased privatization that will stretch the fiscal dollar. And I think that what has to be done, I think at at the state level, and possibly even compacts of states, is really kind of pooling together, thinking about within these areas, within your state or within like-minded states, how do you protect the rights of students? How do you provide for the funding, the funding for your schools? And if you do have vouchers and charters, and how do you make sure that you prioritize public education? And so what comes next, I think, really are these sort of state focused ideas about really kind of protecting public education. And I think that there will also be more of this sort of localism about this, thinking about at the school district level about how to do this. I think local control has over the years, I'm a desegregation guy, has gotten a bad rap and for a lot of reasons. But I think here we have to start thinking about at the local level, because that's really going to be where, public education is going to be carried out. We're going to have to be thinking about how to really make sure that they're going to be able to carry out their job. So that's going to be something going forward at the state level that is going to really have to be focused upon, that states are going to have to take the lead on, and that I think that we may be working together with other states, both in higher ed and K through 12, to figure out how to do that.
It's a really great suggestion, and thinking, I really appreciate your knowledge base, having, both the law degree and knowledge of educational leadership, and really thinking of the intersection there, that idea of local control and how do we use that to our advantage, is a really great point. So thank you for that. I also want to recognize that this speaker series that we've been running this year, Building Bridges, Informing Practices, is a collaboration between the University of Connecticut and CAPS. And I see that Fran Rabinowitz from CAPS was able to join us this morning. Fran, thank you so much for being here and supporting us in this work.
Absolutely. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get here right when you started, but it's just so intriguing to me. I, I was a superintendent in a large urban school district and still am involved there. And it's just heartbreaking to see what is going on, to be honest with you. And I keep thinking, maybe wrongly, that the 2026 elections, and I keep fighting for that and saying that will change the House and maybe we'll slow this down. Any credibility there? What do you think about that?
Um, I run out. This is like, I'm certainly not a political prognosticator.
Yeah,
So like but I, I think even if things get turned around, I still think that the courts are still there,
yeah,
right? And they're still really creating major changes in how our system is working. And so I think that that still is something that states are going to have to grapple with, even if 2026 comes out in a way that one might think may cause some changes. So I still think that regardless of how the election comes out, states are still going to have to be thinking about with these sort of constitutional changes and understandings about the issues that I talked about the protection of student rights and the protection of public money, and ensuring that, that the public good is actually carried out.
yeah. No, I get it, Dr. Green. Thank you for that. Just yesterday, I sit on the CHDI board, which is a mental health provider in the schools, and they were told that by Kennedy that millions of dollars of their funding was cut as of yesterday. As of today, it was reinstated, but in 24 hours, it raised bedlam in that whole organization. And that's probably, I don't know, 10 times I've seen that done this year.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that, this is, now I'm a law and policy person. I think that this environment is teaching us the need for zenning,
Yeah.
and the need for self-care,
Yep,
self-protection, because we're all on this roller coaster right now. And we just
absolutely.
do not know what is going to happen from one day to the next. And I think that what I have been trying to do, is really look at these days as one day at a time. And that you're all here. I know you're all here doing the Lord's work. You're all here trying to do right by kids, trying to do right by systems. And I think the thing is to keep that in mind, that in the end, you're trying to do what's right for kids. And that if you can keeping that bottom line in mind, I think can go a long way, I think, to provide that purpose to deal with these times. But, you know, that's my platitude, but I understand that it's a really hard thing that we're going through.
You're 100%. I think you're 100% right, and I'm just happy to have gotten these few minutes from you. And I do think, you know, we have a hard job ahead of us with our, you know, thankfully we do have a lot of people that listen at the state level, but funding comes slowly. And so I think funding is a big, huge part of this, and I think equity in funding for sure. So we've got a lot ahead of us in the next legislative session. So thank you. I'm going to go to a 10 o'clock meeting, but I
Sure.
appreciate the few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you
And
so
thank you.
much. Really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
everybody. Thank you, everybody, for attending this morning. It was a really engaging conversation. It certainly has left me with an awful lot to think about. And in these times when it can seem like so much is falling down on us, I want you to leave with some of the hopeful messages that I heard this morning. You know, follow the Constitution, do what's right for kids always, and organize and execute at the local level. And that's how we'll make our way through. So, Dr. Green, thank you for being with us this morning, and to everyone, have a wonderful day, and let's keep working together.
Yep.
Keep hope alive.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, everybody.